Nicole Fritz, the Executive Director at the Helen Suzman Foundation, joins us now to share legal opinion on the matter. Nicole, good evening to you and welcome. It's a tough one, and you heard Siphamandla Zondi there talk about the enmeshed arguments and discussions around whether this is political or whether it's purely legalistic and relating to the prosecution of human rights violations. I would just like your thoughts on the fact that, this has become such a political hot potato for South Africa, and by seeking, legal advice on what to do next might well potentially, provide the pathway for South Africa to say, perhaps we won't be signatories anymore. Do you think that that's a possible and a probable outcome of this?
I don't see that South Africa is going to be able to withdraw from its own implementation act, right? In the last few weeks, in fact, it is made clear that in the indications that it had made, that it intended to withdraw from the ICC, and the draft legislation that it had introduced, which would have affected such withdrawal, was to be abandoned. So I don't think that it is plausible or likely that we will see a withdrawal from the International Criminal Court ahead of the August summit in BRICS. And I think failing such a withdrawal, our law is clear. It has been made manifestly clear in the wake of the al-Bashir saga that South Africa, in terms of its international law obligations, but in terms of its own constitutional and domestic law obligations, would be obligated to cooperate with the International Criminal Court and look to effect an arrest were somebody like President Putin, who is subject to such indictment, to be on the territory of South Africa.
And in that piece, really well done by Sophie Mokoena there, going back to the court matter and how it developed, even in light of an appeal against the initial decision, means that we have explored, the length and the breadth, at least in the al-Bashir moment, for how far South Africa could go in resisting what the ICC demands from us in terms of being signatories, to the Rome Statute. So this decision by our government then to try and find other alternatives, how do you see it potentially playing out?
Look, I think South Africa is in an invidious position. I think it's clear that no state wants to arrest another head of state. The diplomatic repercussions are going to be enormous, even if you're not talking about as powerful a state as Russia. We've heard statements in the last few days from Mr. Medvedev suggesting that those who try and effect an arrest warrant of Mr. Putin would themselves be bombed. The crimes with which Mr. Putin is accused are among the most serious. They are grave atrocity crimes. He heads a state which is engaged in an unlawful war at the moment. So given all those circumstances, I certainly don't think South Africa wants to be in a position where it has to effect an arrest of Mr. Putin. But at the same time, South Africa doesn't want to have to be seen to flout its international and domestic legal obligations. And so I think, South Africa is diplomatically in a very delicate position. It is going to have to explain to its Russian counterparts that it would be unfair to place them in this position. And I think the other thing that our presidency and our diplomats are going to have to communicate is that our government is composed of three arms, and our judiciary is an independent branch of government. And even if our executive were minded to give a guarantee that Mr. Putin will not face arrest were he to come to South Africa, they cannot speak for the courts and for our criminal justice system. The likelihood if he came would be that, people would approach the courts to secure an execution of the arrest warrant.
So draw a parallel then between the 2015 moment, al-Bashir, what you're talking about now, and some of the other scope or things that we learned from what happened in 2015.
Well, I think the other thing, the other context to bear in mind, which is sometimes forgotten because of the al-Bashir debacle and what happened in 2015, is that in fact South Africa navigated those tensions incredibly well. prior to al-Bashir's attendance of the AU summit. So al-Bashir had been invited to attend various other diplomatic functions in South Africa, like former President Zuma's inauguration. And there, in fact, South Africa did this delicate negotiation where it communicated to the Sudanese authorities that if Mr. al-Bashir were to attend, they couldn't provide any guarantees that he wouldn't be arrested, given that he was subject of this indictment from the International Criminal Court. And in fact, Mr. al-Bashir then stayed away. And so it was quite surprising in 2015 that they didn't seek to repeat what they had done in previous times, where there was a risk of al-Bashir coming into South Africa. Here we now have anticipating a possible attendance at the BRICS summit in South Africa by Mr. Putin. He, like Mr. al-Bashir, faces indictment by the International Criminal Court. The circumstances by which that arrest warrant is secured is different, and we can talk about the technicalities thereof, because it's not through a Security Council referral. But in fact, the situations are very analogous, and South Africa's obligations would be no different in respect of its duty to effect an arrest warrant for Mr. Putin were he to attend the BRICS summit.
Well, then, just to stay on that theme, Nicole, how do we get out of this cul-de-sac in a way? Given, as you say, it was well handled in the past, the circumstances aren't exactly note for note, exactly the same, slight differences. What scope would South Africa and DIRCO have in this scenario?
I think it's a delicate diplomatic negotiation that they have to undertake. But I think that they, the most powerful, most compelling message that they portray to their Russian counterparts is that South Africa is a constitutional democracy. It is composed of 3 different branches of government. The judiciary is an independent branch, and even if South Africa were minded, the executive were minded to grant Mr. Putin impunity were he to come to South Africa, it cannot make such guarantees on the part of our courts, and therefore it would be in Mr. Putin and the Russian authorities' interests not to come to South Africa, because they would then face the possible arrest. And I think that is the message that the South African government is going to have to convey to their Russian counterparts.
Well, certainly, but we'll be waiting with great anticipation to hear what the ministry in charge, Dr. Naledi Pandor, has to say, what conclusion a government has arrived on this very important diplomatic and political matter. Nicole Fritz, we thank you for your analysis on the subject. She is the Executive Director at the Helen Suzman Foundation.